Good afternoon, and welcome to the afternoon's general session. I'm Mark Crawford, Director of Standard Strategy for SAP, and I've brought you what I hope will be a very educational and informative panel about the dark little secret of IoT, and that's data and what to do with it, especially the dark data, that data that we collect but don't really do anything with. I'm pleased to have on the stage with me Chris Bailey, Klaus Schaff, and Brodsky. They're going to give you a little bit of a talk about what each of their companies have been doing, and then we'll go into a roundtable discussion up here, and at the end we'll try to save a little bit of time so we can field questions from the floor. So first up is Chris. Chris works for the 136-year-old Honolulu-based Pacific Ocean shipping company, Matson Navigation. He leads their innovation garage, which is also known as Matson Labs. In fact, I told Chris, when he told me that it was the Innovation Garage, the first thing that came to my mind was the Skunk Works that Lockheed Martin had back in the 60s for the US government. His team consists of people, processes, and funding dedicated to the genesis and execution of needle-moving ideas. So the floor is yours, Chris.
Thanks, Mark. And aloha, everyone. Here from Hawaii. Matson Navigation is headquartered there. We serve the entire Pacific Ocean. Established in 1882, like you said, 136-year-old shipping company. Generally, you would think that industry, that old, relatively conservative company. However, we are kind of leading the way in our industry on the technology side. When I joined Matson 15 years ago, everything was on a mainframe. And through a course of a 10-year roadmap, we are 100% cloud-based ocean carrier now. So that was quite a journey. Once we got that done, it enabled us to move into this new world of agility, and we've been able to focus a lot of our time and attention on new and innovative technologies, which is where the innovation group came from at Matson. So as far as IoT goes, we've been doing industrial IoT for 20, 30 years, tracking our containers across the Pacific Ocean, and especially in our terminals. But with the advent of the recent technology changes in IoT, we're starting to explore ways to use it on other type of assets. And things that used to be considered second-class citizens are now getting a lot more attention. So things like the chassis or the trucks that drive around the yard and never leave, those things not very important to the customer necessarily, but very important to our efficiency. And so we started to add some IoT in those areas. And that's kind of where we sit. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Next up is Klaus. Klaus Schaff comes to us from Volkswagen. He's the past director of VW California Electronics Research Lab, and he actually built up Germany's first Wi-Fi city. He's currently focused on distributed ledger technology for MaaS, mobile as a service applications. Klaus?
Yeah, I'm coming from the startup company, Volkswagen. I used to say that because digitalization is not really something we grew up with at Volkswagen. We were the metal benders, and we had to learn digitalization a little bit the hard way, because this is now where we are going to be. And in 2001, when I went to California to build up the Electronic Research Lab, that was something completely new also for the company. And you may have heard that we built up Stanley, the first, or the car which won the DARPA Great Challenge. And when we won this, our company said, well, you have done a great job. You have only spent 2 million, and this is worth about 70 million in spending on marketing. So they thought this was just a marketing gag, and nobody really believed in the company that automatic driving would eventually become something the world would be talking about, or which would actually go on the road. And now we are in 2018, and we expect that automatic driving cars will be out in 3, 4, maybe 5 years. But this is really now coming. And so we had to learn, and about 4 or 5 years ago, we started to understand what digitalization in this respect really means, and all the data which are coming together, what we need to do with these data, what can we do, what new business models come up. And so we built several groups. For example, in Munich, we built a data lab, which is looking at the large amount of data which is coming, and we want to see what we as a car company can do with these. And we have the Digitalisation lab in Berlin, which is looking at new software, apps, and stuff like this. Of course, we still have the California lab, which is looking at new technologies, which are evolving in Silicon Valley, and we are still looking what we can bring to our cars. And we have a lot of other activities to learn and to understand better what is coming. So yes, in a way, we are still a startup in this new way of digitalization. But it's also very interesting, and the people at Volkswagen have to learn quite a bit, but it's interesting that everybody really wants to do this, because this is the only way how a lot of people think that the car industry can survive. If we only want to build cars, that will not be enough. We have to learn how to make new business models, to come up with new business models, and that is why mobility as a service has evolved. And beside working on the technology for automotive autonomous driving, we are also looking at the new business models which this brings, and that's where I'm working currently. And as you said before, I'm working currently on distributed ledger technology, also to some known as blockchain technology. We see this as a technology which will bring the possibility to develop new business models as well.
Thank you, Klaus. It's interesting to hear almost, 100-year-old company. Volkswagen referred to itself as a startup, and that's probably why Volkswagen is still around when some of the other car companies have fallen by the wayside. And last but certainly not least is Seb Chakraborty. I've got it right that time. He's global CTO of Centrica Hive Limited. That's a British consumer IoT business group, which is part of the Centrica Energy Group. And interestingly enough, although Seb describes himself as coming from a consumer IoT company, they actually do a lot of work for British Gas. So they're in the industrial IoT space as well. Seb, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, thank you for that introduction. My roots, I guess, I spent 12 years in telco and then found myself in 2013 joining a startup. At the time, we hadn't even come up with the name Hive, so it was a true startup, but it actually came out of British Gas, which is a 200-year-old energy company. It's one of the big four players in the UK and owned by Centrica, which is the mothership, which is listed on the London Stock Exchange. And the journey that I've been on is one about taking an idea and building it into a product and a business which is now the largest connected homes business in the UK in terms of product. And so my journey has been one about learning about how to build a product and launch it into a market, but it's also been about how to build a platform, which is what my teams have been doing, and establishing what it is to be successful in this space. We have started off in the UK. We moved into a few countries in Europe, so we're in Italy and in France. We've gone to North America. We've launched in some states in North America and also in Canada. And what we're doing is an extremely exciting business to be in, because you start off building a product like a thermostat, a smart thermostat, and then we've moved more into the connected home. But what we're really learning to do is deliver a customer experience, and that means using a lot of the data that we get from our devices. So yeah, that's me.
Thanks, Seb. So as you've heard from their personal introductions, we've got a varied end user panel up here, each looking at data from a different perspective, each at a different level of maturity with IoT, from doing it 20 years ago to starting out a few years ago. Just as a reminder, Gartner describes dark data as the information organizations collect, process, and store during regular business activities, but generally fail to use for other purposes. To what extent has each of your organizations looked at dark data and identify what of that is useful and for what applications?
I can kick it off, Mark. So as a technologist, we get very excited about this stuff, right? There could be a gold mine sitting right there, and I want to dive into the details and figure it out and see how I can use it and build something out of it. But then my business units remind me repeatedly, over and over again, don't introduce technology for technology's sake. Let's start with the business problem and let's focus on that. And if some of this dark data happens to be part of the solution, that's great. So constantly reminded not to just look at technology for its own sake, but to go back to our core business problems, try to figure out when the right solutions match the problem at hand.
Klaus, Seb?
The one thing is to collect the data, and the other thing is to curate the data. And I think what we have to do, and where we are going into, is to curating data. It's not just collecting data. Of course, we with our cars and with probably the biggest IoT device which exists on the world, with about 100 devices inside the car, which is collecting data. We could get an awful amount of data and wait and see what we can do, or throw them away or whatever. But I think what we have done is we currently we're looking. Number one, we're looking at the customer. In our belief, the customer in a car owns the data. So if we want to use data from the car, we have to ask the customer and get his permission to use them. And we have to find ways to do this, and we also have to look what we can do with these data right away, and not just collect the data, but then also see for which kind of business models they are available and what the customer eventually can get out of this. And that is something we are currently working on in all these labs I told you already about. And that's where we are, that's a little bit of the philosophy we are working on.
Seb?
Well, so there's an incredible amount of data, and as you say, a lot of it can be hidden. I guess there's two ways of thinking of it. One is that you've got the data already there, and it's unknown. So how do you, you've got the choice of either leaving it there and never doing anything with it, or doing something useful with it. Now, that part is the hard part, and it usually comes with a problem to solve. Once you can work out that you've got a problem to solve, then you start to figure out what to do with that data. I guess the human problem is someone needs to own the looking for a problem to solve, and usually it's a product owner, or it may be a data scientist, and unless you have a team of people who are skilled to make use of that and look for problems, then that data is going to be indeed hidden away. So that's kind of one approach. The other approach is to employ the tools that you've got. So Mark, you and I were talking earlier on about whether it's possible to simply use techniques like deep learning to apply to in a way to go and discover patterns in the data and thereby reveal what might be useful and then therefore become something worth looking at. I think that's another approach, and the final one is the hard one, where you get your teams of engineers who are building your products and connecting your products in a digital way to make sure that they are also asking themselves the hard questions. Do we want this data? And is it useful? And if it is, then please let someone know about it. Because otherwise, what will happen is that a solutions architect will connect up a device and do what they think is right, and soon you've got streams of data being poured into your databases, which may not have value. One of the other aspects of that is around the frequency of the data that you take. You know, do you take all of the data all the time? A battery level on a device every 2 minutes reporting the same thing is not going to be useful. So I think you can end up with floods of data, which you then end up, all becomes hidden.
Thanks. So, Chris, you talked about the need to attack IoT from the business side rather than the technology side, and I was glad to hear that. And frankly, I couldn't agree more. I didn't mention, but I was one of the co-editors of the Industrial Internet Consortium's IIRA document, our reference architecture document, and we put the business viewpoint as one of the critical first steps in defining any IoT architecture. So you believe there's an IoT solution that will be a good match, but as an expert in ocean shipping and not in IoT, where do you start?
Good question. So when we got started in our second round of IoT here recently, we did 3 different things. We tried to read as much as we could read, of course, where everyone would start. We looked for a really good partner. That was the second thing. That turned out to be much more challenging than I expected. In such a hot area, there's partners everywhere. But to find a partner who was not just good at IoT, but also understood the maritime environment as well, is what turned out to be challenging. It took us months of interviews and probably 24 different partners before we found a good match. And then the third thing that I found the most useful and spent the most amount of time working on is experimenting, right? So we had access to some funding. We went out and visited our terminals and our sites, and we brought our equipment with us, and we were given access to the entire terminal, and we would slap a sensor onto a piece of equipment, and we would try to track it. We would use multiple different networking technologies, and we would vet them against each other to see which one turned out to be the best.
Interesting. So, Klaus, you talked about data ownership, and that's certainly a problem that service provider, solution provider companies like SAP have to wrestle with. Who owns the data? Does the customer own the data? Do we own the data that's once we process it? Could you expand a little bit more on how VW came to the conclusion that the customer owned the data, and what are you doing to make sure that that is in fact practiced in Volkswagen?
Well, the thing is, we have a lot of discussion about this, who's owning the data, and I think we don't really want to get into this discussion. So the point is the car owner provides or produces these data, and so we think that he also owns them in a way. And if we want to use them, we have to find a way to make it interesting for him to give it to us, so that he has an advantage to give us the data which are so high that he thinks this is better than keeping them for himself. And if we can do this, then it is of a mutual benefit, and that's the best way. If we have to fight for this, that is not the right way, and then there will be probably more customers who are reluctant to give the data away, other than when we find a way that he has an advantage and we have an advantage. And so the better we do this, the easier it will be, and that is if we can give him a better way to use the car, better service, and then he will probably give it away like he does with Google or whatever. And everybody is giving these data away because they know that they can benefit from what they are doing there, and in a way that is what we have learned from this business model.
Thank you. Seb, you mentioned AI, the conversation that you and I had earlier. How do you see AI impacting your business, and in what ways are you using it, not just for data, but for your entire IoT platform system?
Yes, so we have, we're using it in lots of different ways. So if I think about the IoT part of the business, we're using AI inside our cameras to do smart object person detection. We are using AI to do energy disaggregation. So one of the products that we've got within my business is connecting up smart meters and taking all of that data into a platform, and then being able to disaggregate using machine learning to see what kind of operations are being done inside the house just from the electricity readings. So that's another example of how we're using AI. We're also using AI for understanding what's going on. This is more broadly than simply just IoT, but what's going on with boiler systems. So we have another product where, in partnership with Worcester Bosch, to understand what's going on with when boilers are failing, and all of the telemetry from the bus of a boiler is sent to the platform, and we begin to diagnose what's actually happening with those boiler systems. And finally, if more generally, we're also about customer experience, and that means being able to do things like mine chats, chat history to see what kind of patterns are going on, both in the customer services operation, but also what's going on in terms of the sales process or within e-commerce. So I think generally there's a lot going on within IoT, but also more broadly in the organisation.
Chris, Klaus, any thoughts on that? I would imagine at Volkswagen and your cars are using some form of AI on their platforms since they're autonomous.
We are learning from that, or the car is learning from that, of course, but we also have to understand. So that's always a little bit tricky if we do not understand what the car is really learning. And so that is one of the problems with AI. You need to understand how the car is learning and what it is actually doing in this case. So if we just would go for and hope that the car understands the right things, that could be dangerous. And I think we will try to understand what the car is doing from what it has learned as much as possible, so that not unforeseen things occur.
So you guys have each been there where you've had to start out in this IoT journey within your companies. One aspect of that, and we certainly talked about this in the Industrial Internet Consortium and the data group, what advice do you give to an organization just beginning to develop their IoT systems with respect to their data strategy? Seb?
So I've been on this journey. I've been on a journey where we had no data stack, and then we had to build one. And my advice would be that it's okay to make mistakes early on. But what you do want to do is make sure that, particularly with your data, that you're taking the customers' data really seriously. And I'm thinking both in terms of security and privacy, and making sure that all of that stuff is really robust, because you don't get any second chances with that kind of stuff. But what you are likely to get is some extremely valuable data, and therefore it makes sense to have your data strategies in early, and rather than try to collect all of the data and put it somewhere in the hope that you'll one day mine it for usefulness. It feels that I know that that's going to be an expensive way to do things, and part of part of what I've learned is when you build your teams who are working on a product, make sure that they are consciously thinking about the data elements, because that stuff is often left to the last. You build your product, you connect it up, and then you think that you'll deal with the data requirements later. But actually, it's really important to include those data requirements very early on in the project. And only by doing that, you'll consciously work out how to bring your entire data, the connections between your product and the other products you've already got, you'll make those more valuable.
Yeah, I would second what you're saying, Seb. I mean, you want to collect the data early and keep it. If it's in any way related to a business transaction, you may not have a analytics use case in front of you at the moment, but it's eventually likely to come up. And if you've got the data there, you have, in some cases, 10 or 20 years worth of data, it can be a lot more insightful than if you only have a couple weeks worth because you just started collecting it.
Yeah, I think the good news is that we're seeing analytics engines now that can handle those massive amounts of data. You know, back in the 90s, we had this data warehousing concept, and then there was data mining and data stores, and then we've got data lakes and all these different approaches, but there weren't the powerful tools available to really handle those significant volumes of data. Now we're seeing things like what we at SAP have with our in-memory database, which significantly improves the access to the data that allows you to be able to do those deep machine learning analytics that we couldn't do in the past. And I think that needs to be a key part of your data strategy as well.
So if someone would ask me, I would say, don't fall on the trap and just collect all the data you have or you could get and see later what you can do with it. Do it the other way around. Use the design thinking approach, look at your customer, look what the customer needs or wants, and help him and see when you develop something for the customer that and then look what kind of data you need for that, and then you can look at what kind of data are already available in your car, and not just collect the data just for the for doing and collecting and see what you're doing later with it, but look for it in a way so that you can get the right data at the right time and only the data you need and not just a whole bunch of them.
Yeah, I mean, what's going through my mind is also that there are a lot of stakeholders in a business for your data, for one's data. So the product team are there wanting to improve the products that they put out to to customers, and they're going to want to get insight level data from use case studies as well as from what customers are actually doing with the apps. And so that's kind of one stakeholder, but then you've got your marketing teams who are also really interested in how to market the product and how to make the products interesting to customers. And then you've got your sales teams who wanted to sell as many devices as possible, and then you've got your customer services teams trying to understand how to reduce errors or problems in the contact centers. So you've got lots of different stakeholders wanting different aspects or different insights from that data, and therefore having a kind of a holistic data strategy so that you can surface the various requirements for these various stakeholders during the development of a product, or even with the hidden data we talked about before, I think is really, really important.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, Seb, and I read something recently that said that 0.5% of the data that's collected from IoT sensors is actually processed. The other 99.5% is left somewhere in the system. In many cases, it's not used because the right entities in the organization aren't aware that that data is even being collected, or that it could potentially be available to what Chris talked about earlier, solving a business problem that they have that the IoT team might not be aware of. So how do you set up within an organization ways of sharing the information about the types of data that you're collecting with your IoT system so you can get it to those right stakeholders within your enterprise?
So we actually have a data analytics team within IT services, and part of the thing that they do is they go out and they meet with all the different business groups on an annual basis, and they interview them and they ask them, what's your most pressing and challenging problem? And they look at it together, and they look and they see what's already available in their data lake, if you will, and try to help them solve the problems right there on the spot. And failing that, my team also goes out and talks to all of the business groups as frequently as possible. And we also know or have a fairly good idea of what data is available. And so we can kind of marry those two things together, the business problem and the data that's already available.
Klaus, Seb?
Communication, communication, communication. And talk with the people as much as you know, as is possible, and tell them what is available, and the other way around, what do you need, and then talk with other people, and eventually someone will come up, oh, I have this already. And that's, I think, what's the best way to do it. Otherwise, just collecting it and store this away, that is not helpful.
I would agree with both those two comments. I think the only other thing I would probably add is the right kind of tooling, having a portal for your data, having a dictionary available that you can understand what data you're holding. I think one of the interesting problems with organizations in general is that even within one company, you can find yourself having data silos where you've got data over here, and data over here, and there may be similar sorts of business units, but they're not really sharing the data. I think it's really important to find ways to, in addition to the tooling, doing the thing that you were talking about, which is having some sort of a consulting service who are able to talk to the data and about the data and what that data can do.
So you've each talked about the volumes of data that are being collected. We've talked a little bit about the data that's not used and probably shouldn't be used unless we've identified a business problem. So what do you do with that data? Do you throw it away? Do you keep it at the edge? Do you bring it up into the cloud? Do you bring it into your back-end platforms? Or all of the above? And how do you decide what you should do with it?
So our general rule of thumb is whether or not you think that data has anything to do with the business transaction at hand. And if so, we bring it all the way back, and we try to integrate it into our terminal operating systems, for example, or customer service platform, those kinds of things. Anything else just dies pretty much. And if somebody comes back with something they want, then we can bring it into the system. For the most part, we just let it die and wither until somebody identifies a need for it.
I think it is a little bit like what you do in your own house. If you collect old stuff for long and long, and then there comes one point when you say, I need to throw away things. And sometimes it's better to throw away things earlier than later. And eventually, when it is necessary, the data you have are probably not exactly the right ones. So you have to adopt the way you collect the data in a way which is helpful or is better suited to your problem. And my personal opinion, don't collect too many data. They will be wrong anyway.
I think that having a view about your data types is important. So what data do you need real time, and what data do you need to not have real time? I think that's kind of one element of what we've been trying to do in Hive, but also putting in some policies about how long you keep your data for, and what data you will need to keep in the platform versus what you can actually store on your hub, or in your home gateways, and not pushing everything because you can to the cloud is something that we see as quite sensible from an efficiency perspective. And the last thing I would say is not being scared to archive data off into long-term storage. And so I think a combination of different techniques.
Thanks. One thing that Klaus talked about earlier was this issue of data ownership. One of the things that we've wrestled with in the Industrial Internet Consortium was, is it possible to actually create concentric IoT systems? And by that I mean, let's say you've got a manufacturer that's got factories and he's got all of this equipment on the plant floor. He creates an IoT system. But at the same time, somebody else owned or built those pieces of equipment, and somebody else built subsystems within those pieces of equipment. They would also be very interested in capturing that data. One way to do it would be to create overlaying or concentric IoT systems. Another way would be for that plant owner to actually sell the data. What are your thoughts on selling data? Is that something that people should be looking at, or is that something that probably we should stay away from?
It depends on if the data are valuable. If you just have data, it's not worth it. If they have, if there is a standardization to collect these data, then it's perhaps worth to do it. But just if you don't know the conditions or all the conditions under which the data were collected, then you probably end up with rubbish. And I don't know if I would buy them if I don't know exactly the conditions under which they were collected.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and that's another issue that we've been wrestling with, and that's the issue of context that the data is actually collected in, and that's, nobody's really looking at that, and I think the key word that you used there is standardization. Somebody has to come up with a standardization for the context that the data was collected in. The good news is, and this isn't necessarily context, but the Object Management Group, who's the parent organization for the Industrial Internet Consortium, is actually starting a new standardization initiative around sensor data notation, where they would develop standards for the data that are coming out of the sensors, so allow that data to be shared beyond just the organization that's capturing it. But I think you're right, Klaus. I think that contextualization is going to have to be there as well. And I also think that that will help the analytics of the dark data, because I think that's one of the fundamental roadblocks that even today's most modern analytics engines face, is understanding the context of that data. So, Seb, you talked about vast amounts of data. What are the challenges you're mindful of, and what are you doing about it in your company?
So I would say that the key challenges are on the theme that we talked about before, which is making sure that people are aware of what we've got, and trying to bridge the data silos that can emerge in a large organization. I think those are some of the challenges. I think other challenges I'd say are making sure, not so much for us in general, I'm thinking about organizations around the world, making sure that you're very transparent with what you're doing with your data, and putting in place the right kind of privacy mechanisms and consent mechanisms, because what we hold in our data is extremely precious, both for us and for our customers. So I think the challenges are really around making sure that what we're doing with our data is wisely done.
Chris, you talked about being a consumer. As a consumer, what advice would you share with those in the room that are end-use consumers as well?
Sure. So our reintroduction back into IoT after doing container tracking for a long, long time was this chassis tracking, which are, like I mentioned earlier, what we used to consider a second-class citizen, and now we needed to elevate that and start tracking them. And when we started looking at how to do chassis tracking, we got really into the weeds, deep into the specific problem, exactly how a chassis behaves, how truck drivers hook up to chassis, the angles that they come in at, how tall do they lift it, et cetera, et cetera. We were so focused on the chassis that we almost lost an opportunity to zoom out to the bigger picture and focus on the fact that we really wanted to build more of a platform, right? Something that we could track almost any asset on, not just chassis. And so we ended up zooming out, thinking of it from that holistic view, and we were able to not only track chassis, but turn around and track another type of refrigerated container by just swapping out the sensor. And so focusing on a platform that could be used in multiple use cases is the first piece of advice I would give.
Seb, Klaus, thoughts?
I passed the question.
Fair enough. And speaking of questions, we only have 5 minutes left. Any questions from the audience? Anyone? Don't be bashful.
There's one over there.
Here's your opportunity. Yes. There's a mic over here, I believe.
No.
Sorry.
No.
Hi, Matson. Way too loud. I was just wondering, you talked about, Matson Cloud at Deloitte. We studied this for Vodafone. A lot of the value is in sharing data outside organizations, he talks about. You talk about surfacing data, but how do you surface dark data for, say, suppliers and consumers who might be able to use it, peers if you're looking to aggregate across data sets to get more data, more variety, or out to external stakeholders, whether that's anyone from a government to an entirely different sector. Like, can you surface dark data outside of your own organization?
I'll have a go. I think the first thing is to establish with that dark data whether it's okay to surface from is it firstly non-PI data, and if it isn't, then can it be shared? And that means looking at that data to make sure that it's not going it's not going to cause a problem for the company. I suppose that's the first thing. If it can be shared, then why not? But then you have to make sure you can rigorously anonymize the data and share it with a third party by making sure you've also got your legal frameworks in correctly. But I guess there are levels of this. So going from PI data to a data set which is, for all intents and purposes, shareable beyond simply companies and openly shareable, I think there's a spectrum. And as long as you've got your legal teams and people poring over to make sure you know what you can share, then I don't see any reason why not.
Thank you, Seb. We've got time for one more question. No? Okay. Oops, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Hi, Jerome, Centrica. So earlier on there was a question about who owns the data, whether you own the data, the customer owns the data, and some different answers came up. I'm interested in understanding really how do you go about keeping the control of that data with the customer as opposed to yourselves?
As you know, I'm working on distributed ledger technology, and I think this is a good way. Like standardization, not having tempered data is an important thing, and then the access to the data. And you can do this by controlling this with blockchain or distributed ledger technology. That's where we are currently working on. I cannot say that we are already there. We are working on that. That is an emerging technology, and I think this is the tool, the right tool to achieve this goal. And I hope we will be right. We will see.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for the questions from the audience. Chris, Klaus, and Seb, thank you very much. We're right on time, so I enjoyed all of your answers.